Hello students, today we shall be taking up Indigo from your class 12 book Flamingo. This has been written by Louis Fischer. Louis Fischer was born in 1896 and he died in 1970. He was born in Philadelphia. He served as a volunteer in the British Army between 1918 and 1920. He made a career as a journalist and wrote for the New York Times, the Saturday Review, and for European and Asian publications. He was also a member of the faculty at Princeton University, and Indigo is an excerpt from his book, The Life of Mahatma Gandhi. The book has been reviewed as one of the best books ever written on Gandhi by Times Educational Supplement. Now, it is quite interesting to know that Louis Fischer stayed in Gandhi's ashram in Maharashtra. There are several characters in this story. Mainly, you will come across a lot of sharecroppers. Rajkumar Shukla, Mahatma Gandhi, of course, is there. And then there is a professor, Arts College in Muzaffarpur, that is J.B. Kripalani. Then there is a teacher in a government school, Professor Mulkani. Although these roles are these characters are not there in the story for very long. However, we need to know about them because we'll have a different pattern this year, MCQs, and we never know what is being asked. So we need to be thorough with each and every character too. Secretary of the British Landlords Association, British Official Commissioner of the Tirhut Division, and then there are all these lawyers, Rajendra Prasad, who later on became the first president of India. Charles Freer Andrews, he was the English pacifist. So let's start the reading. When I first visited, now I refers to the author obviously, that is Louis Fischer himself. When I first visited Gandhi in 1942 at his ashram in Sevagram in central India, he said, I will tell you how it happened that I decided to urge the departure of the British. It was in 1917. Okay. Now, till 1917, it is quite interesting that Mahatma Gandhi had not done any movement, and even until now, till now means till 1917, he had not even thought of fighting for India's independence. So this Champaran movement is quite crucial. He had gone to the December 1916 annual convention of the Indian National Congress Party in Lucknow. So this is where the story starts, that he had gone to Indian National Congress Party in Lucknow. He refers to Gandhi. There were 2,301 delegates and many visitors. During the proceedings, Gandhi recounted, a peasant came up to me, looking like any other peasant in India. Poor, emaciated. Emaciated is somebody who is very weak, abnormally weak actually, and said, I am Rajkumar Shukla. I am from Champaran and I want you to come to my district. So where did Rajkumar Shukla meet Gandhi first time? In Lucknow at the Indian National Congress Party meet. I am from Champaran, he said, and I want you to come to my district. Well, Gandhi had never heard of the place. It was in the foothills of the towering Himalayas near the kingdom of Nepal. Under an ancient arrangement, the Champaran peasants were sharecroppers. Now, who is a sharecropper? He is a tenant farmer who gives a part of each crop as a rent. So he had come to the Congress session to complain about the injustice of the landlord system in Bihar, and somebody had probably said that you must speak to Gandhi. So this is what Rajkumar Shukla told Gandhi. Gandhi told Shukla he had an appointment in Kanpur. Now Kanpur is previously, the present Kanpur, Kanpur, was spelt as Cawnpore earlier, and was also committed to go to other parts of India. Shukla accompanied him everywhere. Then Gandhi returned to his ashram near Ahmedabad. Shukla followed him to the ashram. For weeks he never left Gandhi's side. So you can look at the determination of Rajkumar Shukla, how determined he was to get his work done. Impressed by the sharecropper's tenacity, tenacity is quality of being determined, or you can say determination, and story, Gandhi said, I have to be in Calcutta on such and such date. Come and meet me and take me from there. Okay. So the story starts from Lucknow, children, in the Indian National Congress Party meet or annual convention of the Indian National Congress Party in Lucknow in December 1916. Then it is now proceeding to Calcutta. Months passed. Shukla was sitting on his haunches at the appointed spot in Calcutta when Gandhi arrived. He waited till Gandhi was free. Then the two of them boarded a train for the city of Patna in Bihar. There, Shukla led him to the house of a lawyer named Rajendra Prasad. Now, this is the same Rajendra Prasad who later on became the first president of your country, who later became president of the Congress Party and also of India. Rajendra Prasad was out of town, but the servants knew Shukla as a poor wheelman. Who is a wheelman? So a wheelman is a man who is holding and cultivating a small landed estate. Servants knew Shukla as a poor wheelman who pestered their master. Pestered means who troubled with the persistent, who troubled their master with persistent requests to help the Indigo sharecroppers. So they let him stay on the grounds with his companion, that was Gandhi. Now, Gandhi had come along with the Rajkumar Shukla. So the servants at Rajendra Prasad's place thought that he is also one of the peasants. Gandhi was not permitted to draw water from the well lest some drops from his bucket pollute the entire source. How did they know that he was not an untouchable? Gandhi decided to first go to Muzaffarpur, which was en route. En route means still on the way to Champaran to obtain more complete information about conditions than Shukla was capable of imparting. He accordingly sent a telegram to Professor J.B. Kriplani of the Arts College in Muzaffarpur, whom he had seen at Tagore's Shantiniketan school. So, J.B. Kriplani, children, was the INC is Indian National Congress's chief in 1947. He was considered a Gandhian and a socialist. So, the train arrived at midnight, 15th April 1917. Kriplani was waiting at the station with a large body of students. Gandhi stayed there for 2 days in the home of Professor Malkani, who was a teacher in a government school. It was an extraordinary thing in those days, Gandhi commented. For a government professor to harbor a man like me, harbor here means to entertain a man like me. Like me, what does this mean? Basically, in that time, when people were fighting for the cause of free India, okay, so those who supported the cause of freedom for India, they were not entertained, they were not given any refuge or support by other Indians because of the fear of Britishers. In smaller localities, the Indians were afraid to show sympathy for the advocates of Home Rule. So, Home Rule means that those who supported the cause of freedom for India. The news of Gandhi's advent is arrival, and of the nature of his mission spread quickly through Muzaffarpur and to Champaran. Sharecroppers from Champaran began arriving on foot and by conveyance. Conveyance means they were using transport to see their champion. Muzaffarpur lawyers called on Gandhi to brief him. They frequently represented peasant groups in court. They told him about their cases and reported the size of their fees. Now, when these lawyers told Gandhi that they were taking money, they were taking fees from these people, from these peasants, poor emaciated peasants, Gandhi chided the lawyers. Chided, children, means scolded. Now, this is a suggestion, children. When I am explaining the chapter, it will be better if you also keep the books with you. Okay. He said, I have come to the conclusion that we should stop going to law courts. Taking such cases to the courts does little good. Where the peasants are so crushed and fear stricken, law courts are useless. The real relief for these peasants is to be free from fear. Most of the arable is land which is used for or suitable for growing crops. in the Champaran district was divided into large estates which were owned by Englishmen and worked by Indian tenants. The chief commercial crop was indigo children. The landlords compelled all tenants to plant 3/20th, or you can say 15% of their holdings with indigo. So 15% of their holdings, on 15% of their holdings, they were supposed to grow indigo and surrender the entire indigo harvest as rent. So this was quite painful for them. This was done by long-term contract. Okay. So Britishers, later on when presently the landlords learned that Germany had developed synthetic indigo. They thereupon obtained agreements from the sharecroppers to pay them compensation for being released from the 15% arrangement. Now, peasants had to pay the Britishers heavily, and Britishers, now they tried to fool the poor peasants. The prices of indigo had already fallen because of artificial indigo that was being produced, that was there in Germany. But the Britishers tried to fool the peasants. They took money from these peasants and they took high price from these peasants. Britishers used to buy from them earlier and used to sell in Germany. But then when the demand was not there, what did they do? They cunningly tried to fool the peasants. Okay. Meanwhile, then what happened? The sharecropping arrangement was quite irritating to the peasants. Irksome means irritating. And many signed willingly. So then, when they cunningly obtained agreements from the sharecroppers to pay them compensation for being released from the 15% arrangement. So this they did very cunningly. So the sharecropping arrangement became very irritating, and those who resisted, they engaged lawyers, and the landlords in return hired thugs. Meanwhile, the information about synthetic indigo reached the illiterate peasants who had signed and they wanted their money back. So they demanded now that everything was clear. When everything was crystal clear in front of the peasants, they wanted their money back. At this point, Gandhi arrived in Champaran. So you see, Gandhi initially, visits Lucknow, then he goes to Muzaffarpur, and later on, Gandhi even chided the lawyers for collecting big fees from the sharecroppers at Muzaffarpur. So all these points you must remember. He began by trying to get the facts. So now Gandhi arrived in Champaran and he began by trying to get the facts. First, he visited the secretary of the British Landlords Association. The secretary told him that they could give him no information because he was an outsider. Well, Gandhi told him he was not an outsider. Next, Gandhi called on the British official commissioner of the Tirhut division in which the Champaran district lay. The commissioner, Gandhi reports, proceeded to bully me and advised me forthwith to leave Tirhut. Gandhi did not leave. Instead, he proceeded to Motihari, which was the capital of Champaran. Several lawyers accompanied him. At the railway station, a vast multitude greeted Gandhi. He went to a house and, using it as headquarters, continued his investigations. A report came in that a peasant had been maltreated in a nearby village. That means he was not treated well. Gandhi decided to go and see. The next morning, he started out on the back of an elephant. He had not proceeded far when the police superintendent's messenger overtook him and ordered him to return to town in his carriage. Gandhi complied. Complied means he acted in accordance with the command. The messenger drove Gandhi home where he served him with an official notice to quit Champaran immediately. So Gandhi was given an official notice which said that you must leave Champaran quickly. Gandhi signed a receipt for the notice and wrote on it that he would disobey the order. So you can imagine the audacity of Gandhi that he said he signed the receipt, but then he wrote on it that I am not going to obey the orders. As a result, he received summons to appear in court the next day. All night Gandhi remained awake. He telegraphed Rajendra Prasad to come from Bihar with influential friends. He sent instructions to the ashram. He wired a full report to the viceroy. Wired is using wires and cables. He sent the report. Morning found the town of Motihari black with peasants. They did not know Gandhi's record in South Africa. They had merely heard that a Mahatma who wanted to help them was in trouble with the authorities. Their spontaneous demonstration in thousands around the courthouse was the beginning of their liberation from fear of the British. So they were quick to respond. These peasants did not sit quietly when they saw what is happening. They were very spontaneous in demonstrating in thousands around the courthouse, and this was considered the beginning of their liberation from fear of the British, which was more important. The British officials felt powerless without Gandhi's cooperation. He helped them regulate the crowd. He was polite and friendly. He was giving them concrete proof that their might hitherto, might is far, so far, hitherto means so far, dreaded and unquestioned, could be challenged by Indians. The government was baffled, was confused. The prosecutor, that is, prosecutor is a lawyer, requested the judge to postpone the trial. Apparently, the authorities wished to consult their superiors. Gandhi protested against the delay. He read a statement pleading guilty. He was involved, he told the court, in a conflict of duties. On the one hand, not to set a bad example as a lawbreaker, but on the other hand, to render the humanitarian and national service. Please underline this in your books. This is very important. Render means provide, for which he had come. He disregarded the order to leave, not for want of respect for lawful authority, but in obedience to the higher law of our being, the voice of conscience. He asked the penalty due. Please read this paragraph again, it's an important paragraph. The magistrate announced that he would pronounce sentence after a 2-hour recess. Recess is a period of time, children, when the proceedings in the court are temporarily suspended, and asked Gandhi to furnish bail for those 120 minutes. Gandhi refused. The judge released him without bail. When the court reconvened means assembled again, the judge said he would not deliver the judgment for several days. Meanwhile, he allowed Gandhi to remain at liberty. Rajendra Prasad, Brij Kishore Babu, Maulana Mazharul Haq, and several other prominent lawyers had arrived from Bihar. So these are some of the names of the lawyers which perhaps was not mentioned in the beginning slide in the characters. You can just underline this. This is on page 51, first paragraph. Okay. So they conferred with Gandhi. What would they do if he was sentenced to prison? Now, when we said Motihari was black with peasants, I believe I forgot to explain that. Motihari was black with peasants basically means that everywhere people could be seen. There was no space anywhere. So everything, and since obviously their hair were black, and the whole town looked as if it was filled with black color. Okay, so that is why it is called Motihari was black with peasants, like all of them had gathered over there in thousands. Okay, now let's come back to page 51. They conferred with Gandhi. Okay, conferred means discussed. Here it means discussed. What would they do if he was sentenced to prison? Gandhi asked. Why? The senior lawyer replied they had come to advise and help him. If he went to jail, there would be nobody to advise and they would go home. What about the injustice to the sharecroppers? Gandhi demanded. The lawyers withdrew to consult. Rajendra Prasad has recorded the upshot. Upshot is the conclusion of their consultations. They thought amongst themselves that Gandhi was totally a stranger, and yet he was prepared to go to prison for the sake of the peasants. If they, on the other hand, being not only residents of the adjoining districts, but also those who claimed to have served these peasants, should go home, it would be shameful desertion. Okay, leaving someone, desert, D-E-S-E-R-T, desertion here would mean leaving someone behind. Okay, they accordingly went back to Gandhi and told him that they were ready to follow him into jail. The battle of Champaran is one, he exclaimed. Then he took a piece of paper and divided the group into pairs and put down the order in which each pair was to court arrest. Okay, so basically they will do some things, they will do things with the aim of being arrested. Several days later, Gandhi received a written communication from the magistrate informing him that the lieutenant governor of the province had ordered the case to be dropped. Civil disobedience had triumphed the first time in modern India. Gandhi and the lawyers now proceeded to conduct a far-flung inquiry into the grievances of the farmer. Depositions by about 10,000 peasants were written down, and notes were made on other evidence. Documents were collected. The whole area thrived with the activity of the investigators and the vehement protests of the landlords. In June, Gandhi was summoned to Sir Edward Gate, the lieutenant governor. Before he went, he met leading associates and again laid detailed plans for civil disobedience if he should not return. Gandhi had four protracted interviews. Protracted means for a very long time. Who, as a result, appointed an official commission of inquiry into the indigo sharecroppers' situation. The commission consisted of landlords, government officials, and Gandhi as the sole representative of the peasants. Gandhi remained in Champaran for an initial uninterrupted period of 7 months and then again for several shorter visits. The visit undertaken casually on the entreaty means humble request, of an unlettered peasant in the expectation that it would last a few days, occupied almost a year of Gandhi's life. So here we are talking of which peasant? We are talking of Rajkumar Shukla. The official inquiry assembled a crushing mountain of evidence against the big planters, and when they saw this, they agreed, in principle, to make refunds to the peasants. But how much must we pay? They asked Gandhi. They thought he would demand repayment in full of the money which they had illegally and deceitfully extorted. Extorting is something which you obtain by force from the sharecroppers. But Gandhi only asked 50%. There he seemed adamant, writes Reverend J.Z. Hodge, who was a British missionary in Champaran who observed the entire episode at close range. Thinking probably that he would not give way means allow or permit, the representative of the planters offered to refund to the extent of 25%, and to his amazement, Mr. Gandhi took him at his word, thus breaking the deadlock. This settlement was adopted unanimously by the commission. Gandhi explained that the amount of the refund was less important than the fact that the landlords had been obliged to surrender part of the money and with it part of their prestige. So it was something which he agreed, and it was quite surprising, but then he accepted it because according to him, it was not the amount that was important. What was more important was that the landlords had been obliged to surrender part of the money and with it a part of their that the amount of refund was less important than the fact that the landlords had been obliged to surrender part of the money and with it part of their prestige. So it was something huge for the peasants. Okay. Therefore, as far as the peasants were concerned, the planters had behaved as lords above the law. Now the peasant saw that he had rights and defenders, and he learned courage. So he was not afraid of anything anymore. Events justified Gandhi's position. Within a few years, the British planters abandoned their estates, which reverted is returned, okay, to the peasants. Indigo sharecropping disappeared. Gandhi never contented himself with large political or economic solutions. He saw the cultural and social backwardness in the Champaran villages and wanted to do something about it immediately. He appealed for teachers, Mahadev Desai, Narhari Parekh, two young men who had just joined Gandhi as his disciples, and their wives volunteered for the work. Several more came from Bombay, Pune, and other distant parts of the land. Devadas, Gandhi's youngest son, arrived from the ashram, and so did Mrs. Gandhi. Primary schools were opened in 6 villages. Now, Gandhi basically appealed for education because he knew that, it is the education which is going to solve the miseries of these peasants. Their children had to be educated. Health conditions were miserable. Kasturba taught the ashram rules on personal cleanliness and community sanitation. Gandhi got a doctor to volunteer his services for around 6 months. Medicines were available. Okay, anybody who showed a coated tongue was given a dose of castor oil. So these three medicines were initially available: castor oil, quinine, and sulfur ointment. You must remember this, please, from your MCQ's point of view. So castor oil, anybody who had malaria or fever, he received quinine. Anyone whose tongue was coated was given a dose of castor oil, and anyone with skin eruptions received ointment plus castor oil. So Gandhi noticed the filthy state of women's clothes. He asked Kasturba to talk to them about it. One woman took Kasturba into her hut and said, "Look, there is no box or cupboard here for clothes. The sari that I am wearing is the only one that I have." During his long stay in Champaran, Gandhi kept a long distance watch on the ashram. He sent regular instructions by mail and asked for financial accounts. Once he wrote to the residents that it was time to fill in the old latrine trenches and dig new ones, otherwise the old ones would begin to smell bad. Okay. The Champaran episode was a turning point in Gandhi's life. "What I did," he explained, "was a very ordinary thing. I declared that the British could not order me about in my own country." So you remember, it was not an act of defiance. It grew out of an attempt to reduce the sufferings of poor peasants of Champaran. And Gandhi's politics were closely related to the practical day-to-day problems of millions. He tried to mold a new free Indian who could stand on his own feet and thus make India free. He taught the lesson of self-reliance. He dissuaded the lawyers from taking the assistance of C.F. Andrews, an Englishman, in this unequal fight. Self-reliance, Indian independence, and help to sharecroppers were all these bound together. So this was the typical Gandhi pattern. His politics were intertwined with the practical day-to-day problems of the millions. In everything Gandhi did, moreover, he tried to mold a new free Indian who could stand on his own feet and thus make India free. Early in the Champaran action, Charles Freer Andrews, the English pacifist, who had become a devoted follower of the Mahatma, came to bid Gandhi farewell before going on a tour of duty to the Fiji Islands. Gandhi's lawyer friends thought it would be an excellent idea for Andrews to stay in Champaran. Now, this is also very important, okay? Andrews was willing if Gandhi agreed, but Gandhi was vehemently opposed, okay? He was very strongly against this. He said, "You think that in this unequal fight it would be helpful if we have an Englishman on our side? This shows the weakness of your heart. The cause is just and you must rely upon yourselves to win the battle. You should not seek a prop in Mr. Andrews because he happens to be an Englishman. He had read our minds correctly," Rajendra Prasad comments, "and we had no reply. Gandhi in this way taught us a lesson in self-reliance. Self-reliance, Indian independence, and help to sharecroppers." Self-reliance, Indian independence, and help to sharecroppers were all bound together. So with this, we come to an end to the explanation of the chapter. Let us come to the conclusion. So Indigo talks of the exploitation of indigo sharecroppers, as the name suggests, at hands of British planters, and highlights the work that was done by Gandhi to improve the economic, political, cultural, and social life of these sharecroppers. And self-reliance, Indian independence, and help to sharecroppers were all bound together. Now, in case you get a long answer on the lines which are marked, highlighted in yellow, you should be able to include these points. Gandhi's mission in Champaran was to get the poor sharecroppers justice. They were exploited by the rich and influential English landlords. Along with his fight against the existing cruel landlord system in Bihar, he taught the people a lesson in self-reliance, which was indirectly a momentous step, M-O-M-E-N-T-O-U-S, step towards achieving Indian independence. Thousands of peasants spontaneously demonstrated outside the Motihari coach house. They had merely heard that a Mahatma who had come to assist them was in trouble. With the authorities, and he required their help. They knew nothing of Gandhi's record in South Africa. This act of the public was beginning of their liberation from fear of the British. The Champaran episode did not start as an act of defiance. In fact, it grew out of an attempt to decrease the sufferings of the poor peasants. Gandhi devoted all his attention on their day-to-day problems. He analyzed the root cause of the problem, that was fear, and he tried to eradicate it. Whatever Gandhi did, it was with the aim of liberating the Indians from their fear of the officials. This fear, which like a cancer, was enslaving them to a system that was the monopoly of the rich and the powerful British landlords. Gandhi desired to create a free Indian standing on his own feet. He taught his lawyer friends a lesson in self-reliance by opposing the involvement of C.F. Andrews, an Englishman, in their unequal fight. His support would reflect their weakness. Their cause was just, and they must rely on themselves to win the battle. Therefore, we can very comfortably say that self-reliance, Indian independence, and help to sharecroppers were all bound together. These three spheres were not dealt with by Gandhi separately. He utilized the Champaran episode for rural uplift, a task which was dearest to his heart. He believed in self-reliance, just cause, and purity of means to achieve India's independence. I hope the chapter was clear and you enjoyed listening to it. Thank you so much.